A very good afternoon to our audience tuning in from various locations to a webinar hosted by the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. Today's webinar is titled Whither Self-Sufficiency, Unpacking the UAE's Food Security Strategy. This event falls under MEI's Bridging the Gulf Public Education Series, and this constitutes our 15th episode of the series. Our distinguished guest speaker for today is His Excellency Dr. Abdul Nasser Al-Shali, the UAE's Assistant Minister for Economic and Trade Affairs. Please allow me to say a few words about today's topic, food security. Food security as a global concern is more pronounced than ever, with the Russian-Ukraine crisis holding back grain exports. Recently, a report released by Deep Knowledge Analytics, which produced a food security index, ranked both Singapore and the UAE rather highly. From a regional perspective, however, the report states that the Middle East and North African region also has high regional rates of inflation and food insecurity, specifically 75% in expected high inflation and 79% in expected insecurity, as opposed to the region of East Asia and the Pacific, with an expected high inflation rate of 39% and an expected insecurity rate of 30% respectively. So this is the kind of scope that we are trying to tackle in today's webinar by asking our guest speaker the relevant questions, of course. And we will shortly be inviting our Executive Director at the Middle East Institute to provide opening remarks. To give you a short introduction of our Executive Director, Ms. Michelle Teo. She has more than 20 years of experience in both the government and private sectors, and her career has spanned international relations, corporate and digital communications, and her career of foreign affairs previously has taken her all over the world and she served as Singapore's Deputy High Commissioner in Canberra. She then joined IBM, first as communications leader of IBM Singapore and later with IBM ASEAN. And prior to joining the Middle East Institute, Ms. Teo was working with local SMEs focused on digital content redesign for Singapore government agencies. Without further ado, please allow me to invite our Executive Director, Ms. Michelle Teo, to give the opening remarks.
Oh, sorry. My screen was locked. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session under the Institute's Bridging the Gulf series, which was an initiative of Dr. Clemens Che, and which has become very much a fixture of the Institute's regular events. It gives me great pleasure to welcome His Excellency, Dr. Abdul Nasser Al-Shali, Assistant Minister for Economic and Trade Affairs at the UAE Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. Thank you, Minister, for taking time out of a very busy schedule to speak to us today. Food security is an issue that concerns both our countries. We are small, dependent on free and open international trade routes, and stable global supply chains. But the world in the last 3 years has proven to be anything but predictable. In 2022, our focus has turned to the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on oil and gas prices, food supplies, and easy access to goods and services. Above all, there is the threat of climate change. For us in Singapore, and for many small states, climate change is an existential threat. If we don't address it soon and take real action, the world populations could suffer. What can we do then to secure our food supplies? I think to understand what we can do, we must go back to where our priorities lie. Here, Singapore and the UAE are similar. We take actions to secure our supplies in the short to medium term by building our stockpiles, and we look to alternative suppliers in order to plug any gaps. But both our countries also play a long game, putting in place long-term plans and strategies that ensure continuity and stability. In 2018, long before COVID or the Russia-Ukraine war, the UAE had already started to put these building blocks into place with its announcement of a National Food Security Strategy 2051. Sustainability goes hand in hand with the acquisition of agricultural and food production assets. Both our countries seek to balance self-sufficiency against imports, and food accessibility is critical for both our populations. In hearing the UAE story, there will be many elements that are also the Singapore story of how we consider strategies for sustainability and access to stable supply chains. I cannot think of a more appropriate speaker for today than Dr. Al-Sha'ali. The minister's current responsibilities cover the UAE's economic, commercial, and financial interests, and His Excellency oversees the country's economic policies vis-a-vis other countries. Please join me, therefore, in welcoming Dr. Al-Sha'ali today.
Thank you, Ms. Chiu, our Executive Director at MEI. Before I hand it over to Dr. Al-Sha'ali, His Excellency, I'd like to say a few more words about his bio. His Excellency Dr. Al-Sha'ali was appointed as Assistant Minister of Economic and Trade Affairs in January 2020, where he works really closely with His Excellency Ahmed Al-Saiq, the Minister of State in charge of the economic sector in the ministry. So, as our Executive Director has already mentioned, in his capacity, Dr. Al-Sha'ali facilitates the implementation of the country's economic policy towards other countries and ensuring the necessary support is provided to facilitate foreign investments growth. Concurrent to this role, in January 2021, he was tasked with overseeing the Policy Planning Department. He is also Vice Chairman at the UAE International Investors Council, and his board membership roles include the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy and also at Zayed University Council. Throughout his professional career, Dr. Al-Sha'ali has won several awards, notably the Foreign Minister's Medal for the Distinguished Director. Interestingly, and I say this again to emphasize that he is really the right person for today's topic, Dr. Al-Sha'ali holds a PhD in economics from the Australian National University for his thesis entitled Reconceptualizing Comparative Advantage and Food Sovereignty, an Unconventional Approach to Global Food Security. So without further ado, please allow me to invite our guest speaker for today, His Excellency Dr. Al-Sha'ali, to start the presentation. Please.
Thank you very much, Clemens, and thanks to the Executive Director of the Institute and to the Institute. Thanks to everyone who has been working really hard in putting this together. It's always a pleasure to be among colleagues and to be able to speak about a topic that is quite close to my heart and I'm quite passionate about. Let me first start by telling you all how this whole connection with food security started. I think it was the year 2014 or 15 when I got a call from the foreign minister, and in 2015, yes, food security was important, but it's not as important as it is today. And so that's the thinking at the time, and that's how you would look at certain trends and expect, or at least be able to foresee that there might be an issue in the future, I'm assuming. But I got this call and he said, you know, where are you? I said, I'm in the office. He's like, okay, come right away. So I went to see him. And he basically said to me, how can we better evaluate the UAE's food security from the UAE's perspective? So we understand that there are all kinds of reports or indices or publications that would analyze or assess the food security of a certain country in relation to other countries. But how can we better understand our food security, and where do we stand when we look at our food security, both regionally and globally? So that's when I started working on an index. And I remember my first iteration of that index, and I gave it to him and he said, this is a bunch of numbers that don't make any sense. And he was right. The way I presented this to him was not clear because I also did not really understand how to better assess this. A couple of years later, this became a much larger project than a policy paper. And this is when I started doing my PhD and developing a few indices, which Clemens is now quite familiar with in the thesis. And the main thought was, we want to be able to look at the numbers and see how can we situate the UAE in a place that is comfortable for us in the current time for our food security, and will also position us in a very good way in the future. So for example, just to illustrate, as a country that relies majorly or massively on imports for its food security, are we getting the food from the right places? And once you ask this question, you start looking at every single food commodity, and in every single food commodity, you start looking at where are you getting the food from? And then are you importing 10% of your needs from that country, or are you importing 50% of your needs from that country? And that was the first question that we wanted to answer. The second question that we were looking at, as a country with excess capital and excess financial muscle or strength or capacity, we tend to invest also in food security, not only, or not in the way that people think, oh, the UAE is buying land in this country by the thousands of acres or doing that. It's not the case. What we're really looking at is, okay, do we invest directly into the farms? Do we invest directly into the companies that are trading the food commodities? And so that was also another question where we asked ourselves, are we investing in the right places? What if we invest in a country and then the next thing that happens in the country is some sort of a political change in the government, or there might be food protesting or bread rioting, the country is unstable politically, there could be issues in the future. What if the country decides not to allow you to export any food commodities, which is something that happened in 2008 on the back of the global financial crisis? Excuse me. And so those were the two main questions that we were trying to answer from the UAE's perspective. And the intention and the direction that the research and then the findings took is to make sure that whatever we come up with is something that we can see and we can assess based on what we know about what the UAE can do and cannot do. And so if you look at, the different findings, whether it's assessing the comparative advantage in a country with respect to a certain commodity, or whether you're looking at the food sovereignty of a country based on its self-sufficiency per capita, this is general information in the sense of any country can be looking at those findings, can be looking at those rankings for the past 50 years, and they can basically decide how they want to take this forward. And the intention was, yes, this information will be made publicly available. Anyone can access this information. Anyone can see how countries have been performing in terms of their food security and the main staple commodities, which are wheat, rice, and corn or maize. But then each country knows best or knows better how to frame their food security strategy moving forward. This is how the whole thing started, and this is how it led to this fully fledged research that is now published and is available online at a news portal. And so once I had the findings in hand, we started looking at quite a few things. One of them is going back to my first point: how do we diversify our food import sources? For us to be able to do so, we want to make sure that the country is not a country that is prone to bread riots or food protesting, so on. We wanted to make sure that the country does not impose export bans. And even if the country imposes export bans or has the tendency to do so every now and then we need to make sure that whatever amount of food that we import from that country is kept to the minimum percentage possible, so that whenever there is a blockage or there is a disruption in the supply chain for whatever reason, whether it's a COVID-19 pandemic or any other kind of pandemic or even a conflict somewhere, we're able to make up for that lost quantity or volume from any other source, because we do have that. And so based on the findings in the study itself, we have primary alternate sources of imports, secondary alternate sources of imports, and even third and fourth columns. Number two, investing in a country means that also this country should have the capacity to produce food, to trade food, and they also do not have the tendency to ban your exports. Because if I go and invest in a country And that country decides, for any kind of reason, you have a COVID-19 pandemic, food prices are going through the roof, and the country wants to secure its domestic supply for its domestic consumption to make sure that the prices are kept at a reasonable level, then that country would be doing fine, but we will have a problem because we cannot get the food out, or we can't import the food from that country. In the 1980s, and this is one of my favorite stories, my favorite stories that I read about during my research, is that a prime minister or a deputy prime minister from the Gulf region, from the GCC, decided to visit a country in East Asia to see whether it would be worthwhile to invest money in agriculture there. And then when he came back and he was asked, why didn't you make any investments? He said, I don't have an army to get the food out. And so when you look at the statement, or when you try to understand the statement, it just means that if that country decides not to let the food get out of its ports, I have no way to get the food out of its ports. So we want to make sure that when we are investing and we're putting certain amounts of capital investments in other countries, regardless of what kind of form or medium that investment takes, we want to make sure that we are investing exactly where we think that those investments are going to be worthwhile and are going to pay off in the long term. Now, those are the two main points that we are focusing on in terms of our food security here in the UAE. When I take this and I expand it to the region around us, the belief that we have in the UAE is that as a country, we cannot be stable if the country or if the countries or the region around us is not stable. And food security has always been a big theme or a big item on national security agendas whenever national security is being discussed. And the reason this is the case is because despite the fact that you have food producing countries in the region, they are exposed to bread rioting, they are exposed to food protesting because food prices have not been stabilized for the longest time. So whether they produce the food or whether they're importing the food, food prices could easily go significantly higher whenever you have a pandemic like COVID-19, or whenever you have a conflict in two of your biggest producers and exporters of wheat. Excuse me. Based on that, you would see that the connection, even though this is not saying that this is a causation relationship, but let's say it's a correlation or some sort of something that happens in parallel, that whenever food prices go up, especially in the staple commodities of those countries, you would immediately see either a bread riot taking place or food protest taking place at different scales. And so if this continues to be the case, and if we go back to 2011 and see what happened from 2011 onwards, we pretty much know that this cannot be something that is allowed to happen continuously, because it's not going to direct the region except in a very detrimental and in a very negative direction, which we do not want to see, because it's important for the entire region to be stable, and food security is a big component of regional stability. And this means that even if we are successful in diversifying our food import sources, we are successful in investing abroad when it comes to food security, not only for us, but for the region and for countries around the globe, we also want to make sure that the region itself is also able and capable of doing so by supporting them in whatever policies or strategies that they have with regard to their food security. And this, by extension, means that you don't necessarily need to produce every single food commodity that you want to consume, but you have a balanced approach in terms of what do I need to produce and how much do I need to produce of it, and how can I import the other food commodities, or how can I make up for shortfalls from the global market by making sure that I'm as diversified as possible in terms of my food import sources, so on and so forth. Clemens, I know that we talked about keeping this brief so that we can allow for Q&As and a proper discussion. So I'm going to stop here. And you know how it is with academics. Once we start talking, it's very difficult to make a stop. So I'll stop myself now and I'll pass on the floor to you so that you can start with the questions and the discussion. Thank you very much, Clemens.
Thank you, Excellency. I think you gave us a lot of food for thought, and I'd like to remind our audience that we are going to proceed into the Q&A segment. So feel free to throw in your questions via the Zoom chat box, and then we can read them out to our speaker for today. So like you said, Excellency, as academics, we have the tendency to drone on and on about a certain topic, especially if it's within our specialized domain. But I had a question for you to kick things off on your thesis, actually, which, of course, every academic thesis must make an authentic contribution to the literature. And here, in your own thesis, you identified that food sovereignty, which means that countries aim to be self-sufficient in their production of all their food needs, you saw food sovereignty as a threat to global food security. And that's as opposed to the conventional definition of the literature. So could you just take us through, in a brief survey of your findings, how did you arrive at that, and are there any solutions to how you saw things?
This was one of the major definitions or concepts that I was struggling with when I was writing, because the second you say to someone that a country's food sovereignty could be a threat to global food security, everyone is going to, take a step back and be like, no, but that doesn't really make any sense. So allow me to explain. The idea here is that if you look at the 50s, 60s, even the 70s and the 80s, you would notice that there has been this upwards, downwards trend of many countries around the globe trying to be self-sufficient. And there's no problem with trying to be self-sufficient. The problem is, if you want to be self-sufficient, what is the cost? Or you're trying to be self-sufficient at what cost? Are you 90% self-sufficient? Are you 80% self-sufficient? Are you 70% self-sufficient? And if that's the case, then I have two questions for you. Does that mean you can cover your entire population, no matter the size of that population, equally? And then number two, at what cost? And once you start asking that question, you realize that many countries will be like, oh yeah, it's costing us a lot, but it's better than importing food from elsewhere. And so the argument in the thesis is that food sovereignty is not an issue as long as it addresses two main points. The first point, that a country's food sovereignty should contribute to global food security, not undermine global food security, which means that if you're a country that possesses the comparative advantage to produce a certain food commodity, then by all means, go ahead and produce it and trade it in the global market. Number two, that a country's food sovereignty should be stemming from the farmer's food sovereignty, not the other way around. The problem that keeps happening is that you would always see that farmers in different regions, in different countries, they have been farming or planting or producing a certain food commodity for the longest time possible. So historically, they have been really good at it. They have been able to improve it over time. They could be, they managed to increase the yield over time, so on and so forth. But then the country comes in and says, but this is not the food commodity that I want. The food commodity that I want is either wheat or rice or something else that is a staple commodity that I want to consume, or it could be a commodity that they want to trade in international markets, and that does not really contribute to anyone's food security, such as producing cotton, for example. To better help you in understanding this, Clemens, let me go back to the example of Sudan, or let me speak about Sudan. Sudan has a project that has been developed by the Brits called the Jazeera Scheme, and the Jazeera Scheme is a quite an extensive plot of land with a very sophisticated irrigation system for that time. And what that piece of land was producing was cotton. And then in the late 1970s, early 1980s, Sudan took a different turn towards, even earlier, by the way, I think it was even earlier than the late 1970s. They took a turn towards being self-sufficient in wheat production. And so what they did, they transformed the production in the land from cotton to wheat. Now, here's what happened. Sudan was never able to become self-sufficient in wheat. I think they flirted with 90% for maybe a year or two, but then it started taking it took a nosedive into very low numbers. And number two, funny enough and ironically, if they stuck with producing or cultivating cotton, a kilogram of cotton would have gotten them 4 kilograms of wheat, value-wise and price-wise. So the idea here is, okay, you are trying to be self-sufficient in wheat. You want to be food sovereign. You don't want to be depending on other countries in your food security. But what you end up doing is you're not really focusing on what you are good at, which anyways will get you the exact food commodity at a much better rate, at a much more cost-efficient or cost-effective rate for your own food security. And so this is the balance that you need to strike between a country's food sovereignty and global food security.
And this is the production and trade comparative advantage that you later on outlined in the same thesis, I guess, right? Yeah. We've got a number of questions rolling in. The first one is from my colleague Aisha Al-Sarifi, who's asking a question on climate change. And of course, we know that climate change has entered the global agenda as a mainstream topic. And so her question is, what if other countries wherein UAE is investing in terms of agriculture are impacted by climate change? Does the UAE provide support for their countries to adapt to climate change in return? If there are examples, could you list some of them?
I wouldn't want to name specific countries that the UAE would be helping and assisting, but I would rather want to address it from a point of view where the UAE is a responsible country globally. What that means is the fact that we have announced our targets and the year that we're going to achieve those targets, and the fact that we have been working on this despite being a hydrocarbon-based economy or a hydrocarbon producing country says a lot about the role that the UAE wants to play in terms of climate change. Now, climate change itself is also could be argued both ways in terms of, is it really negatively impacting food security? Is it not really negatively impacting food security? And this varies among different countries because certain countries and certain regions have been able to produce more of certain food commodities because of climate change, and other countries have been producing less because of climate change. Now, the countries that are suffering the most are the countries who have been not able to move away from rainfall or rain-fed based food production to irrigation-based food production. And at the same time, they are in certain regions where they are prone to floods, they're prone to droughts, they're prone to all kinds of weather-related or nature-related events that could undermine their food production and by extension, food security. And this takes me back to a point that I mentioned in my opening remarks or in my introduction, that this is where you need to have a proper balance between food production and food imports, and where are you getting the food from?
Thanks for the response. There's another question again from the floor by Elizabeth Ong. And the question is about whether there are comparisons during the drafting of your thesis between the UAE and East Asia, but also Australia's public policies, for example, irrigation policies in the Murray-Darling Basin, and so on. What's your assessment of this comparative, I guess a comparative assessment when you're comparing the UAE with different regions and different countries?
Well, unfortunately for my thesis and in my case, my assessment extends to all countries. So it's 193 countries, 3 different indices. In each index, there are 3 commodities. So there's the food sovereignty index, there's the production comparative advantage, and there's the trade comparative advantage. So the way I looked at the issue was a very eagle bird eye view, 30,000 foot kind of view. And so because my approach is to assess all countries in terms of the 3 indices, I couldn't really deep dive into every single country except and whenever it's relevant to the UAE. So for example, you would see certain comparisons or certain benchmarks between the UAE and Singapore in certain aspects, or there will be certain comparisons between the UAE and countries in the region who have tried to become self-sufficient in a certain food commodity without being successful, and trying to draw lessons from that by saying, trying to be self-sufficient for the UAE is not going to work out because countries around us have tried and they have failed in doing so. But in terms of specific irrigation projects or trying to increase yields in certain regions, that has not been the case unless in the index itself, there were highlights of countries with great prospects or great potential for food security to contribute to also global food security.
Thank you. Another question is on technology, and I think that was inevitable that would come up. And the question, relates to how technology is used to enhance food security at home, such as vertical farming, where the UAE is setting an example in supporting this kind of technology. So the question, can you provide us with an overview where the UAE stands today in vertical farming?
Okay, so one of the big topics nowadays is how can you make sure that there is access to food wherever food is needed. So for example, part of the reason why there have been too many famines in the past is not that the country does not have enough food being produced, but that the country cannot distribute the food equally in the different regions. So whether you look at the Bengal famine, whether you look at various famines in Ethiopia, there has always been enough food, but the food was not going around for whatever reason, because of hoarding, retailers or suppliers trying to make sure that the price is too high before they sell it, or because of infrastructure issues where they can't deliver the food. And so what urban cities and countries that are too urbanized compared to other countries are trying to do is to make sure that there is access to food wherever there are population centers that need that access. To do so, vertical farming or growing food on your rooftops is a fantastic idea because you can have access to certain fruits and certain vegetables without having to leave your compound or leave your community and drive for X number of miles and then try to purchase whatever that you need to purchase, especially when you have something like COVID-19 and lockdowns and people staying at their homes. However, that being said, yes, you can be really good at using as little water as possible to cultivate or to grow certain food commodities. You can have vertical farms in urban centers. You can grow food over rooftops, but you cannot grow everything using those techniques. And that's a problem. So for example, I think I have seen the latest thing that I have seen about rice, and rice is a staple commodity in UAE and it's a staple commodity in East Asian countries, is that rice can now be grown using salty water. Now, is this going to be commercially viable for other countries to do so? Maybe. And if that's the case, that could actually resolve a major issue when it comes to rice, because rice is one of the least traded food commodities around the globe.
Thank you. And you mentioned rooftop farming, which is something we are also looking at doing in Singapore as well, in our public housing, multi-story car parks as well. We got another question on, it's more two parts. It's what are the limitations of your study? That's number one. And part two is how do you prevent the weaponization of food globally?
Well, on the first part, one of the key limitations has been that I could not study as many food commodities as possible. So I focused on three commodities, which are wheat, rice, and corn or maize. But what I really would like to see is the same methodology applied to all food commodities, because my ideal situation or my ideal scenario to see at the end of the study was, okay, what country can trade what food commodities with what country, and not just focus on those three commodities. The other reason why I'm saying this as well is because certain countries are better at producing other food commodities than wheat, maize, and rice. So, for example, Costa Rica is quite good at producing coffee beans, and if I don't have an understanding of how good Costa Rica is at producing coffee or coffee beans in comparison to other countries, I will not be able to better assess Costa Rica, because right now I'm just assessing Costa Rica based on the three commodities that I have focused on. So that's one main limitation. The other limitation is that even though I focus on three staple commodities, but there are other staple commodities that are there, and I haven't included them in the study, such as potatoes, for example, and they are among the 5 most produced commodities worldwide. Those are the main limitations in the study. There were other data-related limitations in terms of, the Food and Agriculture Organization under the United Nations have different ways or techniques of getting the data based on whether the country provides data on a regular basis. Do they have to estimate certain data points? Do they have to forecast certain data because they can't get the data regularly at all times? So those were there are data-related limitations. There are commodities and expansion-related limitations. But what I also mentioned in the thesis itself is that this does not undermine in any way the study itself, because one of the main things that I focused on is to introduce a methodology that works. and to apply it on to three commodities. But then the same methodology can be taken and expanded to any other commodity that whoever is doing the study or the research think is relevant. The second part of the question is on food weaponization, and absolutely, because if you can control food, then you can control food pricing, and if you can control food pricing, you can basically dictate your terms. And that's why I mentioned famines earlier on, and before that, bread rioting and food protesting, because all of those are related to high food prices in one way or the other, or the inability of a country to get food either from its domestic production or by importing it from elsewhere. How can we avoid it? We can avoid it by making sure that we are not reliant or dependent on a single country. If we are a food importing country, we shouldn't be reliant on a single source or two sources of food commodities. And at the same time, if we are a food producing country, we need to make sure that our food production or self-sufficiency policies are consistent. So I cannot basically encourage my farmers to produce a certain commodity for 3 years, and then whenever there's a problem with my water sources or because the price of that commodity dropped internationally, I decide that I don't want to grow this food commodity and I want to basically produce another food commodity that is going to get me higher prices in the international market.
Thank you. You mentioned famine, and of course, we come to the other side of it, which is drought. And of course, it's also inevitable that we'll come to the topic of water security / insecurity. And there are a number of questions. I'm going to just group them together. Firstly, the first part is, can international arbitration over water disputes be applied to avert danger of food insecurity? And the second part is about the desalination efforts in the UAE, especially in the Liwa Desert, and whether there are further plans in this desalination, and if so, will these contribute to food production in any way?
So talking about the first part of the question or the questions, I'm not sure if everyone here knows this, but one of the reasons why countries are not encouraged to export their food production is depending on how much is the water proportion in that food commodity. So to them, if I have certain water resources that I'm trying to guard and trying to protect and trying to sustain in the long term, then I cannot export too much food with massive or major water components, because that means in effect that I'm exporting my water resources. And this is one of the arguments that some countries use to explain why they're not exporting as much as they should be exporting. Now, how can this be balanced? I think the situation is different from one country to another. So for example, if you talk about a country like Bhutan, Bhutan has massive hydropower resources because of their water resources, which means that Bhutan is a country that can produce food and can export food at ease, especially when you take into consideration their small population. But other countries with 10 or 12 or 15 times that population will need to make sure that whatever water resources that they have are being managed in the most efficient way possible, not only to export it, but even if they just want to produce food that is enough or sufficient for their domestic consumption. Now, in the UAE's case, we don't have, obviously, we don't have water resources. And one main reason or major reason why another country has suspended or stopped its wheat self-sufficiency program is because they realized that they have been using most of their underground water resources, that they almost were running dry. And to have some perspective here, they went all the way from being an importer of that commodity to being one of the top 10 exporters of that commodity, but that was not sustainable in the future. So to us, when we look at all of those examples around us, we want to make sure whether it's desalination, whether we are taking water or extracting water from underground, or whether it's basically water resources that are being collected from rainfall, that we are managing our water resources in the most efficient way possible. And that most efficient way possible does not mean that the UAE will become a food producer anytime in the future. Or let's say a net food producer anytime in the future.
Thank you. And the next question really is a bit, it has to do with geopolitics as well. And this question is how have and will the Abraham Accords further ease the problems in food security, considering the bilateral comprehensive economic partnership with Israel earlier this year, which includes cooperation in agri-tech and desert farming?
Well, it's always good to be able to exchange expertise and to understand other views. Israel has been quite successful in protecting its food security and in enhancing and improving its food security over time. And they have managed to do it without necessarily producing everything. But how do you produce what you need to produce in the most efficient and the most effective way possible? And that has to do with managing your water resources in the most efficient way possible, like we're doing and like Singapore is doing. And at the same time, how do you deploy agri-tech and improving those food production techniques? Because for countries that are small in terms of their capacity of production and not that great in terms of historically in terms of producing their own food, you need those fine-tuning tweaks to make sure that you can improve whatever that you're producing. And I think this is where the importance of this relationship comes from, is that ability to exchange and to exchange expertise and learn from each other's experiments and examples.
Thank you. Another one on something related to history as well, and commodities in general, which we have been talking about, is the comment and question is as follows. Claims to offshore commodities was the primary reason of colonialism in modern history. Does renewal of the same quest due to COVID-19 experiences risk bring about the same disease or illness of colonialism? Could you please answer this under the context of your observation on timely procurement, which is as essential as the investment in third-party countries?
Well, one of the themes that I talk about in the thesis has to do with how colonial trends have shaped today's food trading system. So if you look at different regions historically, we have not really moved significantly away from how things used to be, how things have changed now. So you would always see that countries that have suffered from having to produce commercially attractive commodities versus commodities that they have always been producing historically and they have been good at and have been contributing to their food security. So that colonial link has always been there. It has not been broken. It has been weakened in certain places. It has been diminished in other places, but it has not disappeared entirely. And so what you see today is that there were 2 or 3 companies, major companies, that were in charge or in control of trading food commodities in the past. And today you also have a couple of companies that are in charge of all food being traded. So when we talk about food trade or countries exporting food commodities to other countries or importing food from other countries, the first thing that comes to your mind, you would think that, oh, so the UAE exported X amount of lettuce to this country. No, the matter of fact is there's a trading company that has bought that amount of lettuce and they have sold it to this other country through their partners there. And so this link has always been there, but it has evolved from certain companies to other companies. Certain countries have a say in this based on their relationships with those trading companies, but that still doesn't mean that that link has been broken.
Thank you. I think there was also a comment, I think more a comment than a question, about how COVID vaccination drives have been welcomed to reach remote and rural communities. And some countries use food rewards to incentivize people to be vaccinated. And this offers also a window opportunity to reuse this touch point to maintain food security, for example, for booster vaccines. But I'm going to tap on this question and add a part 2 to this comment, which is a question. And the UAE's national food security strategy has the goal of zero hunger. And so I'm going to ask, what about vulnerable groups. How is the UAE addressing food access to vulnerable groups?
Well, as a country, I mean, despite what you see around the globe in terms of food prices being quite high and inaccessible for many segments of the population, we managed here in the UAE through the pandemic, post the pandemic, and even now to make sure that food is accessible. So there are different schemes that are being followed. So certain families that are under a certain level of income are able to take or to buy subsidized food commodities from certain outlets or at all times, and this basically enables them to have that access unhindered or not undermined in any way or another. There are also other schemes that are being followed in terms of, you probably might have seen this in the media when it was, providing billions of meals to certain populations that had no access to food. And you can see it, I'm pretty sure you can find it online. It was announced by the Prime Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid. And so what we're doing, yes, it's about zero hunger globally, but it's also about making sure that segments of our population have access to food, regardless of what's happening to food prices abroad. And this is what I was also referring to earlier on in my comments when I said that a successful country in managing its food security is not a country that can produce its food. It's not a country that is able to diversify its food import sources, and that's it. But is a country that can make sure that food prices within its borders is always at a consistent expected or predicted level, rather than just going up and down, which makes it quite unpredictable and makes it inaccessible to many segments of the population at different times.
Thank you. And you talk about how things have to be done in a systematic way. And next question is on acquisition and investments. And the question is, Abu Dhabi-based agribusiness firm Al Dahra has gone about the acquisition of hundreds of thousands of acres agricultural land across the globe, including investments in Africa. What are the next steps after acquisition and investment?
Let me make something very clear, by the way, which is also something that I was shocked to read about when I was doing my research, is that most of the announced or the media covered land grabs, I'm not just talking about the UAE, I'm talking about other countries as well, are not accurate. So sometimes there are announced deals, sometimes there are deals that come up or come out in the media, but they're not really deals that have taken place. So whether it's Al Dahra in the UAE or any other country in other countries around the globe, that is not necessarily true. So just to put this out there. Now, how do you make sure that if you're investing in agriculture, that you're doing it the right way? Number one, you need to make sure that if you're doing this, you are basing your food production and your agricultural investment on the farmers, not on what the government of that country is most keen on wanting you to produce. And this is the point when I said that a country's food sovereignty should be stemming from the farmers' food sovereignty and what they are able to produce, not the other way around. Which also means that any agri-investment or agro-investment should be socially responsible in terms of benefiting the farmers or whoever is producing the food in that specific region or that plot of land or the different plots of land. Number two, making sure that there's political stability in whatever country that you are investing in, or at least having the guarantees and the checks and balances in place so that whenever there's an issue, you are still able to export the food, not only to the UAE, but also to other countries around the globe based on the food trading system that you have in place. The idea, again, is not to produce, if you want to basically be a successful businessman and trading food, you can't be selling your food just to your country. You have to sell it elsewhere, wherever the food price is actually attractive. One of the most interesting findings that I have seen during my research as well was that most of the food being produced in Africa from Chinese investments in Africa is being sold in Africa, not exported back to China. And the reason why is because it's just most profitable to do so in Africa rather than having to ship it all the way to China, which will incur transportation costs, shipment costs, infrastructure related issues, and make the price way too expensive by the time it gets to China.
Thank you. So I'm going to take one last question from the floor. I think there's nothing that that has come in after that last question. And the question is about the UAE's national food security strategy once more, and its target of being a world-leading innovation-driven food hub. And how far along has the UAE gone in achieving its targets, including the target of being #1 on the Global Food Security Index?
Well, if you read what the index is about, the index is about making sure that there is access to food, that the food is affordable, that the quality and safety of the food is at a high level. And very recently, a few years ago, they introduced whether or not that country is exposed or vulnerable to climate change, which could hinder its production. Now, since we don't really produce much of our food, then that will always be a pillar where we're not doing that great, but we can always do fantastic in the other pillars because of our ability to import the food. Now, the question is, or what we're trying to focus on moving forward, is to be able to import each of our food commodities from as many countries as possible and to minimize the percentage of reliance on certain countries to the bare minimum that we could do. This will allow us to make sure that, okay, we do have the capacity, we have the capabilities to pay for the food and to import it. We just want to make sure that we have the access to different or to various food import sources, and that we can basically get the food not only of great quality and safety standards, but also at a price that is reasonable, that's affordable, and that allows all segments of our population to access that food. And so it's quite premature to say how far or how close we are towards that target. I would rather say that we are on the right track when it comes to our food security, as long as we manage to focus on what we are good at and we keep improving it. Because achieving a certain goal is one thing, but then making sure that you can stay there and maintain for the longest term is another thing altogether.
Thank you very much, Dr. Al-Shali, Your Excellency, for addressing all these questions in a very right manner. Of course, thanks to our audience for rolling out all these questions in quick succession in the chat box as well. Before we end off today's session, I'd like to invite the Chargé d'Affaires at the UAE Embassy of Singapore, Sheikh Saleh Saif Al-Sharqi, to deliver the closing remarks. And just a note on his bio, he was posted to Singapore in 2016, and since then he has been here to strengthen the bilateral relations between the UAE and Singapore, and he holds a Master of Business Administration from SMU, Singapore Management University. Without further ado, please let me invite Sheikh Saleh Al-Sharqi to deliver the final remarks for today.
Thank you, Clemens. Thank you very much. Your Excellency, Dr. Abdel Nasser Al-Shaali, Ms. Michelle To, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon, and I hope you found the seminar insightful and beneficial. Despite the fast economic and technological advance that we have seen over the last 2 decades, million people in the world still suffer an alarming lack of food. The number is likely to increase if the food production and distribution channels are impacted. Food security is a major concern for many countries, either because of inability to produce enough food or because of the negative impact of the global economic and environmental crisis. Today, and because of the COVID-19, the ongoing geopolitical development, food security has become more than ever national security priority. But facing those challenges will require an establishment of bilateral, regional, and international alliance to benefit from the worldwide expertise, experience, and resources in the hope of turning all this into a profitable, shareable, and equitable distribution instead of being a source of competitiveness. Singapore and United Arab Emirates enjoy a special bilateral cooperation. The cooperation includes several areas such as a new industry and technology, green economy, smart cities, capital development, culture, as well as other vital areas of the both countries. I'm happy that the Middle East Institute has taken the initiative to organize this talk and invite His Excellency Dr. Abdel Nasser Al-Shaali to talk about the UAE food strategy in depth and provide a platform for discussion between the participants. In conclusion, I'm convinced that this talk will be beginning of the other meetings to catalyze and establish bilateral dialogue between Singapore and United Arab Emirates in the hope of developing a framework for more sustainable cooperation in food security. Being two credible gateway for both respective regions, such cooperation in this vital sector will positively reflected on people and countries of the Middle East and Asia. And thank you all for attending this seminar, and I wish you all a good day ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheikh Saleh. And with that, we come to the end of today's webinar on Bridging the Gulf. Again, fantastic addition to the series by Dr. Abdul Nasser Ashali's back and forth dialogue on food security. And we hope to stay in touch, of course. And I thank everyone for their participation in one way or another, and also for the energetic questions that make the discussion so lively. So thank you again, and hope to see you on our next webinar.